Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world without bread, without wheat fields swaying golden in the summer breeze, without harvest festivals or the promise of spring after a long, cold winter. Hard to picture, isn't it? Because agriculture isn't just about food. It's the foundation of civilization itself. It's what allowed our ancestors to stop wandering and start building, to create communities, cities, cultures. And in ancient Greece, all of that abundance, all of that life-giving power belonged to one goddess, Demeter. Now, Demeter doesn't always get the spotlight. She's not hurling thunderbolts like her brother Zeus or starting wars like Ares. She doesn't have the dramatic flair of Aphrodite or the strategic brilliance of Athena. But make no mistake, Demeter is one of the most powerful deities in the Greek pantheon because she controls something that even the other gods depend on, the food supply. Without her goodwill, nothing grows. Fields turn barren, animals starve, people perish. And when Demeter is unhappy, as we'll discover, the entire world feels it. Tonight, we're going to explore the myths and mysteries of this often underestimated goddess. We'll walk through golden wheat fields and dark underworld corridors. We'll witness a mother's grief that could end civilization and see how a single act of violence shaped the seasons themselves. We'll meet the heroes she favored and the fools who crossed her. And we'll understand why, for the ancient Greeks, Demeter wasn't just a goddess to honor. She was essential for survival. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin the story of Demeter, the goddess who taught humanity to farm, who gave us bread and beer and the rhythms of the harvest, and who, when pushed too far, could make the earth itself forget how to bloom. Every god has an origin, and Demeter's begins in the age before the Olympians ruled, back when the cosmos was young and the Titans held dominion over all things. Her parents were Cronus and Rhea, two of the most powerful beings in existence. Cronus, the Titan of time and harvest, had overthrown his own father Uranus in a violent coup, and having seized power through patricide, he lived in constant fear that his own children would do the same to him. So Cronus made a horrifying choice. Each time Rhea gave birth, he swallowed the infant whole. Not to kill them exactly, the children were immortal gods after all, but to imprison them within himself, where they could never threaten his throne. One by one, Cronus consumed his offspring. First came Hestia, goddess of the hearth, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, and then Poseidon. 5 children, each swallowed at birth, trapped in the dark belly of their father. Demeter was the second child, caught between her older sister's fate and the siblings who would follow. Imagine spending your earliest existence not in the light of day, not learning to walk or talk or explore, but in a void of nothingness. Some myths suggest the swallowed gods remained conscious, aware of each other in that cramped darkness, waiting for a rescue that might never come. Others say they slept, dreaming of a world they'd never seen. But Rhea, their mother, was not content to lose all her children to her husband's paranoia. When her 6th child was born, a boy she named Zeus, Rhea hid him away on the island of Crete. In his place, she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Cronus, who swallowed it without a second thought. Zeus grew up in secret, raised by nymphs and fed on the milk of a divine goat, until he was strong enough to challenge his father. The war that followed would reshape the cosmos. Zeus returned to his father's palace with a special potion, crafted to make Cronus vomit up everything he'd ever swallowed. And one by one, Zeus's siblings emerged, fully grown gods and goddesses, ready to reclaim their birthright. Poseidon came first, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, and finally Hestia, the eldest. They'd been inside their father for years, but immortals don't age like mortals do. They emerged powerful, furious, and united in their desire for vengeance. The Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympians, lasted for 10 years. It was a conflict of unprecedented scale, with mountains crumbling and the very earth splitting open from the force of their battles. Demeter fought alongside her siblings, wielding what some sources describe as a golden sword, or perhaps a golden sickle. The weapon had history. Some say it was the very blade Cronus had used to castrate Uranus, repurposed now against its former master. Demeter's role in the war wasn't as celebrated as Zeus's thunderbolts or Poseidon's earthquakes, but she was there, fighting for the freedom that had been stolen from her at birth. When the Titans finally fell, the victorious Olympians divided the cosmos between them. Zeus took the sky and became king of the gods. Poseidon claimed the seas. Hades received the underworld. The three brothers cast lots for these domains, but Demeter and her sisters Hera and Hestia were not part of that particular lottery. Instead, Demeter found her calling in something equally essential. She became the goddess of agriculture, of the harvest, of the grain that sustained mortal life. The name Demeter itself tells us something about her nature. In ancient Greek, her name was Demeter, Demeter, possibly derived from the words meaning earth and mother. Some scholars translate it as earth mother or grain mother. In the Doric dialect, she was called Demeter. Whatever the precise etymology, the meaning is clear. Demeter is the mother who provides, the mother who nourishes, the mother who makes the earth fertile and ensures that humanity can eat. But here's something interesting. While Demeter became known primarily as an agricultural goddess, she was never quite as earthbound as, say, Gaia, the primordial earth itself. Demeter was more refined, more civilized. She represented not just wild nature, but cultivated nature. Not just any plant growth, but the specific grains that humans could harvest, process, and turn into food. Wheat, barley, corn. She was the goddess of farming, not just fertility. The goddess of organized agriculture, not just random growth. In a way, she embodied the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations. And this is important, because in ancient Greece, agriculture was everything. It was the backbone of society, the reason cities could exist at all. Without reliable crops, you couldn't feed a population large enough to build temples, write plays, philosophize about the nature of the cosmos. Demeter made civilization possible, and the Greeks knew it. They honored her in festivals throughout the year, timed to the agricultural calendar. They built temples to her in every region. They taught their children to respect her, to thank her for every loaf of bread and every cup of wine made from grain. So Demeter settled into her role as one of the 12 Olympians, though she spent far more time on Earth than many of her siblings did. She walked among the fields. She taught humans the secrets of sowing and reaping. She blessed the soil and ensured the rains came at the right time. And for a while at least, things were good. The world was fertile. Humanity prospered. And Demeter found joy in her work. But of course, in Greek mythology, peace never lasts forever. And for Demeter, the greatest trial of her existence was still to come. A trial that would test her power, her patience, and her very sanity. A trial that would change not just her, but the entire world. Because when you take something from a mother, especially a mother with the power to make the earth itself stop growing, the consequences are apocalyptic. Let's take a moment to really understand what Demeter represented to the ancient Greeks, because her importance goes far beyond simply being the goddess of farming. Agriculture, to the Greeks, wasn't just a job. It was the rhythm of existence itself. It dictated when you worked and when you rested, when you celebrated and when you prayed. The harvest was life. The fallow season was survival. And every year, the question hung in the air like morning mist. Will the crops grow this year? Will we have enough to eat? Demeter answered that question. Her blessing meant abundance, full granaries, children who didn't go hungry, communities that could afford to spare time for art, for philosophy, for building the magnificent civilization that ancient Greece became. Without her, all of that crumbled, and the Greeks understood this in their bones. They didn't just worship Demeter out of tradition or obligation, they worshipped her out of desperate, practical necessity. Her domain was vast and specific all at once. She presided over wheat and barley, the two staple grains that formed the basis of the Greek diet. Bread was made from these grains. Beer was brewed from them. They could be stored through the winter, ground into flour mixed with water to make porridge. Grain was life, and Demeter was the one who made grain grow. She taught humans which seeds to plant and when, how deep to sow them, when to water and when to harvest. She gave humanity the plow and showed them how to yoke oxen to till the soil. She was, in essence, the architect of the agricultural revolution, But Demeter's influence extended beyond just growing crops. She was also a goddess of sacred law and civilized order. Think about it. Agriculture requires planning. It requires respecting seasonal cycles. It requires cooperation, because farming is hard work that benefits from shared labor. You need to divide land fairly. You need to trade surplus goods. You need laws to govern who owns what field and who gets how much of the harvest. All of these things, the very foundation of organized society, fell under Demeter's purview. She was called the lawgiver in some regions, the goddess who didn't just feed bodies, but who taught humans how to live together peacefully. And then there's the fertility aspect. Now, when we say fertility, it's easy to immediately think of human reproduction. And yes, Demeter was associated with that to some degree. She was honored at weddings. Her priestesses sometimes taught young couples about the duties of marriage. But more than human fertility, Demeter represented the fertility of the earth itself, the ability of soil to produce crops, the cycle of growth, death, and rebirth that characterized agriculture. You plant a seed, it seems to die in the earth, but then it sprouts, grows, and produces more seeds. This miraculous transformation was Demeter's gift. She carried several symbols that made her instantly recognizable. The most obvious was the sheaf of wheat, those golden stalks bundled together, representing the harvest. You'd see her in art holding a sheaf, or wearing a crown woven from grain. She also carried a cornucopia, the horn of plenty, overflowing with fruits and grains and vegetables. This wasn't just a pretty image, it was a promise. Follow Demeter's ways, honor her festivals, and you'll have abundance. Insult her, and well, we'll get to that. Another of her symbols was the torch. Now, torches might seem odd for an agricultural goddess, but the torch has a specific meaning in Demeter's mythology. It represents her search, her quest, her refusal to give up. We'll dive deep into why she needed those torches soon, but for now just know that when you see Demeter, depicted with flaming torches in each hand, it's not about lighting fields at night. It's about a mother's determination to find her missing child, even if it means illuminating the darkest corners of existence. Her sacred animals were equally telling. The pig was especially important to Demeter. Pigs were sacrificed to her during festivals, particularly at the Thesmophoria, a women-only festival celebrating fertility and agriculture. Why pigs? Because pigs are incredibly fertile animals. They produce large litters. They're also associated with the earth because they root around in the soil. And there's a myth, which we'll explore later, about why pigs became particularly sacred to Demeter, tied to the most devastating event in her mythological life. Serpents were also sacred to her. Now, serpents might seem like an odd choice for a goddess of agriculture, but in ancient Greece, snakes were symbols of rebirth and renewal. They shed their skin and emerge fresh. They live in holes in the earth, connecting the surface world with the chthonic depths below. Demeter was often depicted with winged serpents pulling her chariot. These weren't evil creatures. They were her sacred attendants, her connection to the mysteries of life, death, and transformation. And then there's the poppy, beautiful bright red, growing wild in the wheat fields. Poppies were Demeter's flower. Her priestesses wore them. They appeared in her art. But poppies, as the Greeks well knew, produce opium. They're flowers of sleep, of dreams, of forgetting. And in a strange way, they're also flowers of the underworld, because the sedative effects of poppy extract could be seen as a little death, a temporary escape from consciousness. The Greeks saw no contradiction in associating Demeter with both life-giving grain and death-suggesting poppies, because Demeter, more than almost any other god, understood that life and death were two sides of the same cycle. Which brings us to a crucial point. Demeter wasn't just a goddess of the surface world. She had deep connections to the underworld, to the realm of the dead. In some cults, she was worshipped as a chthonic goddess, a deity of the earth's depths. This made sense. After all, seeds are buried in the ground in the dark before they can grow. Death precedes life. Decay nourishes new growth. And Demeter, as the goddess of agriculture, presided over this entire cycle. She understood, perhaps better than any other Olympian, that you can't have spring without winter. You can't have harvest without the fallow time. Her personality, as described in the myths, was maternal but not soft. She was nurturing, yes, generous with those who honored her, patient with those who sought to learn from her, but she was also capable of immense wrath. When insulted or harmed, she didn't shout or throw things like some gods might. Instead, she withdrew. She stopped caring for the earth. And the results were catastrophic. Because unlike Zeus, who might strike you down with a thunderbolt and be done with it, Demeter's anger affected everyone. Crops failed, livestock starved, entire populations faced famine. Her wrath wasn't personal, it was universal. And that made it all the more terrifying. The Greeks told many stories about Demeter, but one towers above all the others. It's a story of love and loss, of power and powerlessness, of a mother who would burn the world down to get her daughter back. It's a story that explains why we have seasons, why winter is cold and barren, why spring brings renewal. It's the story at the very heart of Demeter's mythology, and it begins with a girl in a meadow, picking flowers, completely unaware that she's about to become the center of a cosmic crisis. Picture a perfect spring day, the kind where the sun is warm but not too hot, where a gentle breeze carries the scent of wildflowers, where everything feels possible and nothing feels dangerous. This is the kind of day it was when Persephone went out to pick flowers with her companions. Persephone, Demeter's daughter, the light of her mother's life, a young goddess, beautiful and innocent, who loved nothing more than wandering through meadows, gathering blooms. Now Persephone's very existence tells us something important about Demeter. Her father was Zeus, which meant Demeter had been intimate with the king of the gods at some point. Some versions of the myth describe them as consorts, at least for a time. Others suggest it was a brief liaison, but the result was Persephone, also called Kor, which simply means the maiden. She was the springtime personified, fresh, young, full of potential, and Demeter adored her beyond all measure. Mother and daughter were inseparable. Where Demeter went, Persephone followed, learning the secrets of agriculture, the names of every plant, the songs to sing to make crops grow strong. They were a unit, a pair. Two goddesses so intertwined that worshippers often didn't pray to one without invoking the other. In some temples they were simply called the two goddesses, with no need for individual names. Everyone knew who you meant. So on this particular spring day, Persephone went out with her friends, a group of nymphs who kept her company. They wandered into a meadow in Sicily, or perhaps it was in Nysa. The sources disagree, but the location doesn't really matter. What matters is that the meadow was glorious. Roses, crocuses, violets, irises, hyacinths, every flower you can imagine, blooming in riotous color. The girls laughed and sang and wove garlands for their hair. It was the kind of carefree moment that seems like it should last forever but never does. And then Persephone saw it, a flower unlike any other. A narcissus, some sources say, though descriptions vary. What matters is that it was extraordinary, the most beautiful bloom she'd ever seen, growing slightly apart from the others. She had to have it. So she wandered away from her companions, just a little, reaching down to pluck the flower. Her fingers brushed the stem. The earth split open. Just like that. No warning, no build-up. One moment she's picking a flower, the next the ground beneath her feet cracks apart with a sound like thunder, and darkness yawns up from below. And out of that darkness came a chariot, pulled by black horses, driven by a figure cloaked in shadow. Hades, lord of the underworld, had come for her. Now here's where the myth gets uncomfortable, because we have to acknowledge what's actually happening here. This isn't a romantic abduction. This is kidnapping. This is a violation. Hades had seen Persephone from his dark kingdom below and decided he wanted her as his bride. And rather than say courting her or asking her opinion on the matter, he simply took her. He grabbed her, pulled her into his chariot, and drove back down into the earth. The ground sealed shut behind them, and just like that, Persephone was gone. Her companions heard her scream. They searched frantically, calling her name, tearing through the meadow, but there was no trace of her, no sign of where she'd gone. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole, which, of course, it had. The nymphs didn't know what to do. How do you explain to a mother that her daughter simply vanished, that she was there one moment and gone the next? They knew this would devastate Demeter. They just didn't know quite how much. When Demeter learned that Persephone was missing, her first emotion was confusion, then concern, then panic, then an all-consuming, world-shattering grief that would nearly destroy civilization itself. She dropped everything, forgot her duties as a goddess, abandoned Olympus, and set out to search for her daughter with a single-mindedness that bordered on obsession. For 9 days and 9 nights, Demeter searched. She wandered the earth, calling Persephone's name until her voice went hoarse. She carried torches, yes, those famous torches, lighting her way through dark forests and deep valleys. She didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't rest. Every parent who's ever lost a child, even temporarily, even for just a terrifying minute in a crowded store, can understand a fraction of what Demeter must have felt. But this wasn't a minute. This was days stretching into eternity. Days with no answers, no clues, no hope. On the 10th day, Demeter encountered Hecate, the goddess of magic and crossroads. Hecate had heard Persephone's scream, but hadn't seen what happened. Together, the two goddesses sought out someone who would have seen. Helios, the titan of the sun, who rides his golden chariot across the sky each day and sees everything that transpires on earth. Surely he would know where Persephone had gone. Helios, when pressed, told Demeter the truth. "Your daughter has been taken by Hades," he said, "carried down to the underworld to become his queen. And Zeus, your brother, and Persephone's father, gave his permission for the match." This wasn't a crime or a tragedy, Helios suggested. This was a marriage arrangement between two powerful gods. Persephone should consider herself fortunate to wed the ruler of the underworld. But Demeter heard none of the rationalizations. All she heard was that her daughter had been stolen, that Hades had taken her by force, that Zeus, who should have protected his own child, had instead handed her over like property. The rage that filled Demeter in that moment was cosmic. It was the fury of every mother who's ever had her child endangered, the wrath of the earth itself when its gifts are treated with disrespect. And so Demeter made a choice. If Zeus thought he could give away her daughter without consequence, he was wrong. If the gods of Olympus believed they could ignore her grief, they would learn otherwise. Demeter withdrew from the world. She disguised herself as an old woman hiding her divine nature. She refused to return to Olympus, and most crucially, most devastatingly, she stopped making things grow. The earth began to die. It wasn't immediate. At first, perhaps no one noticed, but as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the reality became impossible to ignore. Crops that should have sprouted stayed dormant. Seeds planted in the ground simply rotted. Trees that should have borne fruit stood barren. Grass yellowed and died. Animals, finding nothing to eat, starved. And humans, utterly dependent on agriculture for survival, began to face famine. Demeter wasn't actively destroying anything. She wasn't cursing the fields or blighting the crops. She was simply doing nothing. And in her absence, in the absence of her blessing, the natural order itself began to collapse. Because it turns out, the world needed Demeter far more than Demeter needed the world. Disguised as an elderly woman, Demeter wandered the earth in her grief, untethered and lost. She had no destination, no plan. She simply couldn't bear to return to Olympus, where Zeus presumably sat on his throne, unconcerned about the daughter he'd bargained away. And she certainly wasn't ready to confront Hades in his dark kingdom below. So she walked. And eventually, her wandering brought her to a town called Eleusis. Eleusis sat about 14 miles northwest of Athens, nestled in a fertile plain that, under normal circumstances, would have been perfect farmland. But these weren't normal circumstances. Even here, the blight was spreading. Still, the people of Eleusis were kind. When they saw an old woman sitting by their well looking exhausted and heartbroken, they offered her water and rest. They didn't know she was a goddess. They simply saw someone in need and responded with compassion. The royal family of Eleusis was particularly hospitable. King Celeus and Queen Metanira welcomed the stranger into their home. They offered her food, though Demeter had no appetite. They offered her shelter. They asked her story, and Demeter, maintaining her disguise, told them she'd been separated from her family and was searching for work. Metanira, seeing an opportunity, asked if the old woman might serve as a nurse for her infant son. Now, different versions of this myth give different names for the child. In some tellings he's called Demephon, in others Triptolemus. The details shift between sources, which is common in Greek mythology. For our purposes, we'll focus on the version from the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which calls the child Demephon. What matters is that Demeter agreed to care for the boy, and in her grief-stricken state, she became attached to this human infant in a way that surprised even her. Demephon thrived under Demeter's care. She anointed him with ambrosia, the food of the gods. She breathed on him gently, infusing him with divine essence. And at night, when everyone else was asleep, she would place the child in the hearth fire. Not to harm him, the fire wouldn't burn divine-touched flesh, but to burn away his mortality. Demeter was trying to make this human baby immortal, to give him the gift of eternal life. It was an act of affection, perhaps even an attempt to fill the void left by Persephone's absence. If she couldn't be a mother to her own daughter, at least she could be a perfect nursemaid to this mortal child. But one night, Metanira woke from sleep and came to check on her son. She found Demeter holding Demephon over the flames, and she screamed. Any mother would. She couldn't know what was really happening. All she saw was someone putting her baby in fire. She snatched the child away, yelling accusations, demanding to know what this nursemaid was doing. And Demeter's carefully maintained disguise shattered. Her divine nature blazed forth. The old woman vanished, replaced by the magnificent goddess in her full glory. Light filled the room. The air crackled with power, and Metanira, realizing her mistake, fell to her knees in terror. "You foolish woman," Demeter said. "I was trying to grant your son immortality. I was burning away his mortal flesh so he could live forever. But you've interrupted the ritual. Now he'll die like any other human. He'll grow old and perish. He could have been eternal, but your ignorance has doomed him to mortality." Metanira begged for forgiveness, but the damage was done. Still, Demeter didn't leave immediately, because despite her anger, despite her grief, she recognized that the people of Eleusis had shown her kindness when she needed it most. They'd welcomed a stranger, offered food and shelter, treated her with dignity. And even though they'd inadvertently ruined her gift to them, Demeter decided they deserved something in return. She commanded the people of Eleusis to build her a temple, a magnificent shrine where she would reside and where, in time, she would teach sacred mysteries. These mysteries would be the most profound rites in all of Greece, ceremonies that would offer initiates hope for the afterlife, and a deeper understanding of death and rebirth. The Eleusinian Mysteries, as they would come to be known, would draw pilgrims from across the ancient world for nearly 2,000 years. But all of that was still to come. For now, Demeter simply needed a place to sit with her grief. The temple was built. Demeter retreated into it, and from within those sacred walls she continued her work of destroying the world through neglect, because yes, she'd revealed herself to the people of Eleusis. Yes, she'd promised them secrets and sacred rites, but her daughter was still missing. Persephone was still trapped in the underworld, and until that was resolved, Demeter had no intention of blessing the earth's fertility ever again. The famine intensified. It had been months now, perhaps longer. The myth isn't precise with time, and the situation was becoming dire. Mortals were dying, animals were going extinct, and even the gods were starting to worry, not out of compassion for the mortals, though that played a role. No, the gods were worried because mortals brought them offerings. They built temples, they performed sacrifices, and if all the mortals died out, who would worship the gods? Who would burn incense and pour wine and sing hymns? The gods' power, in a very real sense, depended on human devotion. Zeus, sitting on his throne on Mount Olympus, finally realized he had a crisis on his hands. He'd thought Demeter would eventually get over her daughter's abduction. He'd assumed the matter would blow over. He'd been catastrophically wrong. So he sent messenger after messenger to Demeter's temple at Eleusis. Hermes went, Apollo went, probably Athena and a few others too. They brought gifts, they offered flattery, they promised rewards if she'd just come back to Olympus and resume her duties. Demeter refused them all. No gifts could replace her daughter. No amount of flattery mattered when Persephone was suffering in the underworld, and she wasn't about to resume her duties, wasn't about to save humanity from starvation until her daughter was returned to her. This wasn't negotiable. This was a line drawn in crumbling, barren soil. Zeus finally understood. He'd have to undo what he'd done. He'd have to confront Hades and demand Persephone's release, because if he didn't, there would be no world left to rule over. Everyone would starve, the cosmos itself would collapse, and all because he'd underestimated a mother's love. So Zeus sent Hermes, not with gifts this time, but with a command. "Go to the underworld," Zeus told the messenger god. "Tell Hades he must release Persephone. Not forever, necessarily, but enough to calm Demeter's wrath. Work out a compromise. But get that girl back to the surface before we all pay the price for my bad decision." Hermes descended into the realm of the dead. He delivered Zeus's message, and Hades, pragmatic god that he was, agreed. Mostly, because Hades had one trick left to play, one small act that would ensure he didn't lose Persephone entirely. He offered her a pomegranate. The pomegranate, such a small thing, a fruit with jewel-like seeds, sweet and slightly tart. In most circumstances, it would be nothing more than a pleasant snack. But in the underworld, food has power. Ancient Greek tradition held that if you ate anything in the realm of the dead, you became bound to that place. You couldn't fully return to the world of the living. You belonged, at least in part, to Hades' domain. Whether Persephone knew this rule when she accepted the fruit is a matter of debate among different versions of the myth. Some sources suggest she was tricked, that Hades deliberately didn't warn her of the consequences. Others imply she knew full well what eating would mean but was too hungry to care. She'd been in the underworld for months, and who knows if she'd eaten anything during that time. Still, other versions suggest Persephone ate the seeds willingly, even eagerly, because by this point she'd realized that being queen of the underworld came with its own kind of power. Regardless of her motivations, the result was the same. Persephone ate 6 pomegranate seeds. Just 6, hardly anything at all. But those 6 seeds sealed her fate. She'd consumed food from the underworld. She was bound to it now, at least partially. Hades could truthfully claim that she couldn't leave permanently. She belonged to his realm as much as she belonged to the world above. When Hermes arrived to escort Persephone back to the surface, he found her sitting beside Hades, looking pale but regal. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd been dragged into the darkness. Months in the underworld had changed her. She carried herself differently now. There was a gravity to her, a weight that comes from having seen the realm of death up close. She was still Persephone, still Demeter's daughter, but she was also becoming something else, something darker and older and harder to define. Hermes explained the situation. Zeus had commanded her release. Demeter was destroying the world in her grief. Persephone needed to come back to convince her mother to end the famine. But, Hermes added carefully, if she'd eaten anything while in the underworld, the rules would be complicated. Hades spoke up. "She's eaten 6 pomegranate seeds," he said, "which means she cannot leave entirely. She belongs to the underworld now. But perhaps a compromise could be reached. Perhaps she could spend part of each year here with me and part of the year on the surface with her mother. That seems fair, doesn't it?" Fair is a generous word for an arrangement made after an abduction, but Zeus, when informed of the situation, accepted it. The alternative was letting Demeter continue her agricultural strike until everyone died, and that wasn't workable. So the deal was struck. Persephone would spend 4 months of every year in the underworld with Hades. The other 8 months, she'd be free to return to her mother and the world above. Different versions of the myth alter the timing. Some say Persephone spends half the year below and half above. Others say 1/3 and 2/3. The specifics vary, but the core idea remains the same. Persephone became a goddess of 2 realms. She was Kor, the maiden of spring, when she walked the surface world, and she was the dread queen of the underworld when she descended to sit beside Hades on his dark throne. She belonged to life and to death equally, and every year she would have to transition between these 2 aspects of herself. When Persephone finally emerged from the underworld and reunited with Demeter, the relief was overwhelming. Demeter, who had been locked in a state of frozen grief for months, felt warmth flood through her again. She embraced her daughter. She wept. She laughed. She was whole again. And in her joy she released her hold on the earth. Crops that had lain dormant suddenly sprouted. Flowers bloomed overnight. Trees bore fruit. The famine ended as quickly as it had begun. Spring exploded across the world in riotous color and abundance, but the joy was bittersweet, because Demeter knew the compromise that had been struck. She knew that in a few months Persephone would have to return to the underworld. She knew she'd have to say goodbye to her daughter again and again, for all eternity. And each time Persephone descended back into Hades' realm, Demeter's grief would return. Not as all-consuming as before, she'd learned to cope, to manage, to function despite the pain, but still powerful enough to affect the world. And that's how the seasons were born. When Persephone is with her mother, Demeter is happy. She blesses the earth with abundance. Spring brings new growth. Summer brings the full harvest. The world is green and warm and alive. But when autumn arrives and Persephone must descend back to the underworld, Demeter's mood darkens. She withdraws her favor. Plants die back. The earth grows cold. Winter comes, and nothing grows. The world enters a period of dormancy, waiting for Persephone's return. This wasn't just a poetic explanation for the changing seasons. For the ancient Greeks, it was the literal reason why winter existed. Demeter's grief made the world cold. Her joy made it bloom. The cycle was eternal, as reliable as sunrise, as inevitable as death itself. And every year when winter began to fade, and the first flowers pushed through the last snow, people would know. Persephone is coming home. Spring is returning. Demeter's daughter has emerged from the darkness once more. But the myth isn't just about seasons. It's about loss. About how we cope with losing the people we love, even temporarily. It's about how separation changes us. Persephone wasn't the same girl who'd been picking flowers in the meadow. She'd become the queen of the underworld, powerful and solemn and strange. And Demeter wasn't quite the same either. She'd learned that even gods can't protect their children from every danger, that even divine love can't prevent loss. The myth is also about power, specifically about how much power Demeter actually had, even though she was never portrayed as the chief goddess. She couldn't stop Hades from taking Persephone, couldn't override Zeus's decision to allow the abduction, but she could withhold her gifts from the world. And that withdrawal, that simple refusal to do her job, nearly destroyed all of creation. It's a reminder that sometimes the people who keep things running, the ones who make sure everyone else is fed and cared for, have more power than anyone realizes, until they stop, until they say, no more. And for Demeter, the annual separation from Persephone was a wound that never fully healed. It just became manageable, expected, built into the calendar. The Greeks could mark time by it. When Persephone descends, winter is coming. When Persephone returns, plant your crops. The goddess's personal tragedy became the rhythm of agricultural life itself. Which brings us to Eleusis, where Demeter had promised to teach sacred mysteries. Because the people there had shown her kindness, she would share with them secrets that no other mortals knew. Secrets about death, about rebirth, about what lies beyond the veil. The Eleusinian Mysteries would become the most important religious cult in ancient Greece, and their power came directly from Demeter's experiences of losing and reclaiming her daughter. Eleusis became the center of something profound, something that would endure for nearly 2,000 years and attract initiates from every corner of the ancient world. The Eleusinian Mysteries weren't just religious ceremonies. They were transformative experiences that fundamentally changed how participants viewed death and the afterlife. And they were Demeter's gift to the people who had shown her compassion in her darkest hour. The mysteries were secret, seriously secret. Initiates took vows of silence that were enforced with the threat of death. Even today, centuries after the last ceremony was performed, we don't know exactly what happened during the rites. Ancient writers who underwent initiation would reference the mysteries in their work, would hint at their power, but none of them broke their vow. None of them described the specifics, which means that one of the most important religious movements in ancient history remains shrouded in deliberate mystery. What we do know comes from archaeological evidence, fragments of ancient accounts, and careful inference. The mysteries took place annually in 2 stages. The lesser mysteries were held in early spring, around February or March, in a suburb of Athens. These served as a preliminary initiation, a preparation for the main event. The greater mysteries happened in autumn, around September, and lasted for 9 days. 9 days, echoing the 9 days Demeter had searched for Persephone. The greater mysteries began with initiates gathering in Athens. Thousands of people would show up, rich and poor, men and women. Enslaved people were allowed to participate, which was unusual for ancient religious rites. The only requirement was that you speak Greek and hadn't committed murder. That's it. Demeter's cult was remarkably inclusive for its time. Everyone was welcome to seek the knowledge she offered. On the first day, the sacred objects of Demeter were carried in a procession from Eleusis to Athens. These objects, whatever they were kept in a sacred chest and were only handled by priests. The procession marked the beginning of the festival. On the second day, initiates were told to go wash in the sea, purification through water, symbolic cleansing. They'd sacrifice a piglet, Demeter's sacred animal, and the blood would wash away their old selves, preparing them for rebirth. Then came fasting. The initiates would abstain from certain foods, particularly pomegranates, which makes sense given the role that fruit played in Persephone's story, and they'd drink a special potion called kykeon. Ancient sources describe kykeon as a mixture of barley, water, and mint, but some modern scholars have speculated that it might have contained other ingredients as well, psychoactive substances perhaps. Ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and produces effects similar to LSD. The theory is controversial and we'll likely never know for sure, but the fact remains that something about the kykeon was significant. Drinking it was a key part of the initiation. After several days of purification and preparation, the initiates would walk from Athens to Eleusis. The Sacred Way, it was called, 22 kilometers of road connecting the two cities. The procession would be festive, with music and dancing and shouting. They'd stop at certain points to perform rituals, to tell jokes and stories, to honor Demeter and Persephone. By the time they reached Eleusis, they'd be exhausted but exhilarated, ready for whatever came next. And what came next happened in the Telesterion, the great hall of initiation at Eleusis. This building was massive for its time. It could hold thousands of people. The architect who designed it was Iktinos, the same man who built the Parthenon. That should tell you how important the Eleusinian Mysteries were. They commissioned one of the greatest architects in history to build them a temple. Inside the Telesterion, something happened. Something that we don't fully know. The initiates would gather in the darkness. The ceremony would begin. And at some point, lights would blaze. Something would be revealed. Some sources suggest that the priests would display sacred objects, pulling them from the chest that had been carried from Athens. Others hint at dramatic reenactments of Demeter and Persephone's story. Still others propose that what was revealed wasn't a physical object at all, but a spiritual truth, a vision, an understanding of the cycle of life and death that could only be conveyed experientially. What we know for certain is that people who underwent the mysteries came out changed. Ancient writers speak of it in reverent tones. Cicero, the Roman statesman, wrote that the mysteries taught people not just how to live well, but how to die with hope. Pindar, the poet, said that those who'd been initiated had seen the end of life and its God-given beginning. These weren't idle compliments. The Eleusinian Mysteries genuinely seem to remove people's fear of death. And this makes sense given Demeter's story. She'd experienced loss. She'd descended, metaphorically at least, into the depths of despair. But she'd also experienced return, reunion, the joy of spring after the desolation of winter. The mysteries taught that death wasn't the end. It was just part of a cycle. What descends will rise again. What is lost can be found. Persephone went to the underworld and came back. Seeds are buried in the earth and sprout into new life. The cycle continues forever. This was an enormously powerful message in the ancient world. Most Greek religion didn't offer much comfort about the afterlife. The standard belief was that when you died, your shade, your ghost, would descend to Hades' realm and exist in a kind of grey, joyless eternity. You wouldn't be tortured unless you'd seriously offended the gods, but you wouldn't be happy either. You'd just exist, forever, in the gloom. Not a pleasant prospect. But the Eleusinian Mysteries promise something better. Not immortality in the sense of never dying, Even the initiates would still die, but a better afterlife, a place of light and joy for those who'd been initiated. The exact details were never specified, because that would violate the vow of secrecy, but the promise was clear. Undergo the mysteries, learn Demeter's secrets, and death becomes less frightening. For nearly 2,000 years, this promise drew people to Eleusis. Emperors were initiated, philosophers, poets, ordinary farmers. Everyone who could make the journey came seeking what Demeter offered. The cult spread beyond Greece to Rome, where Demeter was worshipped as Ceres. It became one of the most enduring religious movements in Western history. And then in 392 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius declared Christianity the official religion of the empire and banned all pagan cults. The Eleusinian Mysteries, which had survived for so long, were finally forbidden. The temple was destroyed shortly after. The priests were killed or scattered. The sacred objects were lost, and the secrets, the actual content of the rituals, died with them. We'll never know exactly what the initiates saw in that darkened hall. We'll never know what truths Demeter shared with them. The mystery remains, appropriately enough, mysterious, but we can see its impact. For 2 millennia, people believed that a goddess who'd lost her daughter and gotten her back could teach them how to face death without fear. And perhaps that belief, more than any specific ritual or revelation, was the real secret at the heart of the Eleusinian Mysteries. Demeter's gift to Eleusis was profound, but it wasn't her only contribution to mortal civilization, because while the mysteries taught people about death and rebirth, Demeter also taught them something far more practical. She taught them how to farm. Before we go further, we should acknowledge that the ancient Greeks knew perfectly well that humans had been farming for thousands of years before their civilization arose. They weren't delusional. But mythology isn't history. It's story. It's meaning-making. And when the Greeks told stories about the origins of agriculture, they wanted to honor the goddess they believed had made civilized life possible. So they created myths about Demeter teaching humanity to farm. And the central figure in these teaching myths was a hero named Triptolemus. The story of Triptolemus is intertwined with Demeter's time at Eleusis. Remember that royal family who'd shown Demeter hospitality? King Celeus and Queen Metaneira? Well, they had another son. Different sources give different accounts of his name and role, but most agree that Triptolemus was a prince of Eleusis, who caught Demeter's particular attention. In some versions of the myth, Triptolemus was the infant Demeter had tried to make immortal before Metaneira interrupted. In other versions, he was an older brother, or perhaps a different son entirely. The details shift, but the core story remains consistent. Triptolemus was a mortal who impressed Demeter, perhaps with his intelligence, perhaps with his compassion, perhaps simply with his willingness to learn, and Demeter decided to reward him by sharing the secrets of agriculture. Now Demeter didn't just tell Triptolemus how to farm. She didn't hand him a scroll of instructions and wish him luck. She taught him directly how to prepare the soil, how to select the best seeds, how to plant at the proper depth and spacing, when to water and when to let the fields rest, how to recognize when grain was ripe for harvest, how to use a scythe, how to thresh wheat to separate the edible grain from the chaff, how to store crops so they'd last through winter. Every detail of agriculture, from the first spadeful of earth turned over to the final loaf of bread baked, Demeter showed Triptolemus. And then she gave him a mission. Take this knowledge, she said, and spread it to the world. Teach every human civilization you can find. Show them how to grow their own food. Make sure humanity never has to depend on hunting and gathering alone. Turn them from nomads into farmers. Give them the foundation for civilization. To help Triptolemus complete this monumental task, Demeter gave him a chariot. But not just any chariot. This one was pulled by winged serpents, dragons that could fly through the air. With this vehicle, Triptolemus could travel anywhere. He could cross oceans and mountains. He could reach the most remote corners of the known world. And wherever he went, he carried Demeter's gift, seeds of wheat, seeds of barley, the tools and knowledge to transform any fertile land into farmland. The ancient Greeks told many stories about Triptolemus's journeys. He flew to Scythia, the lands north of Greece, and tried to teach the king there about farming. But the king, Lincus, was jealous. He didn't want this foreign hero getting credit for introducing agriculture to his people. So Lyncus tried to murder Triptolemus in his sleep, but Demeter was watching over her chosen hero. She intervened, transforming Lyncus into a lynx, a wild cat, as punishment. Triptolemus escaped and continued his mission. He traveled to Achaea and taught the people there, but when he stopped to rest, a local prince named Antheus tried to steal the flying chariot. Antheus climbed aboard and attempted to take off, but he couldn't control the winged serpents. The chariot crashed. Antheus was killed. Demeter, grieving yet another unnecessary death, nevertheless ensured that Triptolemus could continue. She provided him with new dragons and sent him on his way. He went to Arcadia, to Sicily, to distant lands whose names were barely known to the Greeks who recorded these myths. Everywhere he went, he taught, and everywhere he taught, civilizations flourished, cities grew, populations expanded, art and philosophy, and all the other benefits of settled life became possible because people no longer had to spend all their time searching for food. They could farm, they could produce surplus, they could specialize, they could become something more than mere survivors. Triptolemus in these myths became almost as important as Demeter herself. He was her prophet, her ambassador, the mortal who carried her divine wisdom to the world. And when he finally completed his mission and returned to Eleusis, he was honored as one of the founders of the Eleusinian Mysteries. Some versions say he became a priest of Demeter's cult. Others say he became a judge in the underworld after his death, rewarding those who'd lived just lives. Either way, his legacy was secured. But Triptolemus's story also contained a deeper message. 3 commandments, supposedly taught to him by Demeter and passed down through the mysteries. Honor your parents, honor the gods with the fruits of the earth, and spare the animals. These weren't complex theological principles. They were basic guidelines for living well. Respect your family. Be grateful for the food you have. Don't cause unnecessary suffering. Simple wisdom, but powerful in its simplicity. The myth of Triptolemus also serves another purpose. It connects Demeter directly to every Greek who ate bread, drank beer, or benefited from agriculture in any way. You're alive because of her, the myth says. Your entire civilization exists because Demeter chose to share her knowledge. Every meal you eat, every harvest festival you attend, every moment of peace and prosperity you enjoy, you owe to her generosity, and to Triptolemus, who carried that generosity across the world. This gratitude permeated Greek culture. Farmers would offer the first fruits of their harvest to Demeter. Bakers would pray to her before starting their work. Communities would hold festivals in her honor throughout the agricultural year. The Thesmophoria, a women-only festival celebrating fertility and agriculture. The Haloa, marking the winter solstice and the promise of spring's return. The Proerosia, blessing the fields before plowing. Every step of the farming calendar had its rituals, its prayers, its offerings to the goddess who made it all possible. And Demeter, for her part, continued to bless those who honored her. She was generally a benevolent deity, patient with honest mistakes, generous with those who worked hard, protective of farmers and their families. But there's an important caveat here. Demeter was patient with those who honored her. If you disrespected her, insulted her, or worse, if you harmed something sacred to her, well, her patience had limits, and her punishments, when they came, were brutal in their precision. Which brings us to a mortal who learned this lesson the hard way. A king who thought he could ignore divine law, a man whose name became synonymous with insatiable hunger. His name was Erysichthon, and his story is a warning about what happens when you desecrate what's sacred to Demeter. Erysichthon was a king in Thessaly, a region in northern Greece. He was wealthy, powerful, and utterly lacking in piety. While most Greeks approached the gods with a mix of respect and fear, Erysichthon approached them with disdain. He didn't believe they deserved worship. He certainly didn't think they could actually enforce their will on someone as important as him. This was a dangerous attitude to have in ancient Greece, and it would prove fatal. Near Erysichthon's land stood a sacred grove, ancient oaks, tall and magnificent, planted centuries before. These trees were holy to Demeter. People would come to this grove to pray. They'd tie ribbons to the branches, offerings to the goddess. They'd leave gifts at the base of the trees. They'd celebrate festivals under the canopy. The grove was a place of worship, a sanctuary, protected by divine law. But Erysichthon needed timber. He was building a banquet hall, something ostentatious to display his wealth, and he needed large beams to support the roof. And the trees in Demeter's sacred grove were perfect. Old growth, thick trunks, exactly what he needed. So he decided to cut them down. His servants, when he announced this plan, were horrified. "Those are sacred trees," they said. "They belong to Demeter. You can't just cut them down. You'll bring down the goddess's wrath." But Erysichthon didn't care. He mocked their concerns. He insulted the goddess. And he ordered his men to take axes and head into the grove. The men refused. They weren't willing to risk divine punishment for their king's vanity. So Erysichthon grabbed an axe himself and marched into the grove. He chose the largest oak, a tree so old it was practically the forest's heart. And he swung. The axe bit into the bark, and blood flowed from the wound. Yes, blood. The tree bled, because a dryad, a tree nymph, lived within that oak. She'd inhabited it for centuries, her spirit bound to the wood and leaves, and when Erysichthon's axe cut her home, it cut her as well. The nymph's voice rang out from inside the tree, pleading with him to stop, begging him to reconsider, warning him of the consequences. But Erysichthon, drunk on his own arrogance, ignored her. He kept chopping, blow after blow. The dryad screamed, the tree groaned, and finally, with a sound like the earth itself sobbing, the oak fell. The dryad died with her tree, but her last words were a curse. "May you suffer for this," she said. "May Demeter punish you as you deserve." And then her voice went silent. Erysichthon laughed. He ordered his men to clear away the fallen tree and cut down the others. The entire grove was destroyed. The sacred space Demeter had blessed was turned into a lumber yard, and Erysichthon went home, pleased with himself, unaware that he'd just sealed his doom. Demeter learned what had happened, and her fury was terrible to behold. Not the cold fury of her grief over Persephone, not the passive withdrawal that led to famine. This was active wrath, focused, personal. Erysichthon had killed one of her nymphs, had desecrated her sacred grove, had shown contempt for everything she represented. He needed to be punished in a way that would make clear just how badly he'd miscalculated. Demeter summoned Limos, the spirit of hunger. Not ordinary hunger, not the kind that makes your stomach growl before dinner. No, Limos was starvation personified, famine made flesh, the gaunt, hollow-eyed embodiment of insatiable need. Demeter commanded Limos to enter Erysichthon's body, to nest in his belly, to make him so hungry that no amount of food would ever satisfy him. Clymahos obeyed. She crept into Erysichthon's bedchamber while he slept and breathed her curse into him. And when Erysichthon woke the next morning, he was ravenous. He called for breakfast. A full banquet was laid before him. He ate everything, every scrap of food, every crumb. And he was still hungry. He called for more. Lunch was prepared. He devoured it. Still hungry. Dinner. The same. He ate enough food for 12 men, and it was like throwing kindling on a fire. The more he ate, the hungrier he became. His appetite was a bottomless pit, an abyss that could never be filled. At first, Erysichthon thought this was just a temporary condition. Maybe he'd gotten sick. Maybe it would pass. So he kept eating. He emptied his kitchens. He spent enormous sums of money buying food from neighboring kingdoms. He consumed everything he could get his hands on. Meat, bread, vegetables, fruit, anything. And none of it helped. The hunger only grew. His wealth began to drain away. Every coin he had went to buying food. He sold his possessions, his jewelry, his furniture, his land. He sold his horses and cattle, not for their meat, though he ate that too, but just for the money to buy more food. He beggared himself in his desperate attempt to feel full, and he never did, not for a single moment. Finally, Erysichthon had nothing left to sell but his own daughter, a girl named Mestra, innocent of her father's crimes, but suffering for them nonetheless. He sold her into slavery, traded his own child for enough money to buy one more meal, and that meal, of course, did nothing to ease his hunger. But Mestra had a secret. She'd once been loved by Poseidon, and the sea god had given her a gift, the ability to shapeshift. When her new owner fell asleep, Mestra transformed herself into a bird, and flew back to her father. Erysichthon, still starving, saw an opportunity. He sold her again, and again, and again. Each time, Mestra would shape-shift and escape, and each time, Erysichthon would sell her to someone new. His own daughter became his only renewable resource in his endless quest to feed his hunger. But even that wasn't enough. Eventually there were no more buyers, no more money, no more food. Erysichthon had eaten everything, consumed his entire fortune, destroyed his life chasing an appetite that could never be satisfied. And in the end, driven mad by starvation despite having eaten enough food to feed a city, Erysichthon did the only thing left to him. He began to eat himself. His own flesh, piece by piece, bite by bite. He consumed his own body, trying desperately to fill the void in his stomach. And of course it didn't work. The hunger remained, and Erysichthon died, emaciated, despite having eaten constantly, a warning to anyone who might think to disrespect the gods. The myth of Erysichthon is brutal. It's meant to be. It's a story about hubris and sacrilege, about what happens when you take what isn't yours, when you destroy something sacred, when you treat the divine with contempt. Erysichthon thought he was above consequences. He thought his power and wealth made him untouchable. He was wrong, and his punishment perfectly mirrored his crime. He'd destroyed Demeter's abundance. So she cursed him with abundance's opposite, eternal, unsatisfiable need. But the story is also about environmental destruction, about taking from nature without respect or gratitude. The sacred grove wasn't just a religious site, it was an ecosystem, a forest that had stood for centuries. And Erysichthon destroyed it, for his own convenience, for his banquet hall, for his ego. The punishment he received serves as a warning. Nature isn't infinite. The earth's bounty isn't unlimited. And those who act like it is, who consume without consideration, will eventually find themselves starving despite their wealth. This theme runs through many of Demeter's myths. She's not just the goddess who gives, she's also the goddess who can take away. Her generosity is paired with the threat of withdrawal. Honor her, and you'll have abundance. Insult her, and you'll know famine. It's a balance that ancient agricultural societies understood intimately. You can't just take from the soil forever. You have to give back. You have to rest the fields. You have to respect the cycles. Otherwise, the land dies, and you starve. Demeter's symbols reflected this dual nature. Yes, she carried wheat and a cornucopia, symbols of abundance, but she also carried a golden sickle, the blade that cuts down what has grown. She wore poppies, flowers associated with both sleep and death. Her sacred animals included serpents, creatures that live in the earth's dark places. She was connected to the underworld through her daughter. She understood death as well as life, loss as well as gain, and her worship reflected this complexity. Let's take a closer look at the objects and symbols associated with Demeter, because they tell us a great deal about how the ancient Greeks understood her. Every symbol carries meaning. Every sacred animal or plant represents some aspect of her nature or her myths, and when you put them all together, you get a surprisingly complex portrait of a goddess who was far more than just the lady who makes wheat grow. The sheaf of wheat is the most obvious symbol. It appears in almost every artistic depiction of Demeter. She's shown holding a bundle of golden grain stalks, sometimes wearing them as a crown, always associated with this most important of crops. Wheat was the foundation of the Greek diet. It was ground into flour for bread. It was malted for beer. It was the difference between civilization and chaos. And Demeter held it like a scepter, a reminder of her power over human survival. But there was also the torch. 2 torches actually held in each hand. These torches represented her search for Persephone. They were the light she carried through dark places, the illumination that refused to give up hope. Torches also connected Demeter to the underworld. Travelers to Hades' realm often carried torches to light their way through the darkness. And Demeter, who'd metaphorically descended into the depths of despair when Persephone was taken, shared this symbol with other chthonic deities. The torches suggested that Demeter understood darkness as well as light, that she'd been to the edge of the abyss and come back. The cornucopia, or horn of plenty, was another common symbol. It's a horn overflowing with fruits and grains and flowers, representing inexhaustible abundance. The message was clear: Demeter provides more than enough. She doesn't give sparingly. When she blesses the earth, she does so generously, almost lavishly. The cornucopia appears in art alongside Demeter, sometimes held by her, sometimes held by figures near her. It was a promise. Follow her ways, honor her festivals, and you'll never lack for food. Then there's the golden sword or sickle. This is a more ambiguous symbol. Some sources describe it as the weapon Demeter wielded during the Titanomachy, the war against the Titans. Others suggest it was actually a sickle, the tool used to harvest grain, made divine through association with the goddess. There's even a myth that this blade was the same weapon Cronus used to castrate Uranus, repurposed after the war. Whatever its origins, the golden blade represented Demeter's power to reap what has grown, to harvest, to end one cycle so another can begin. Her sacred animals were equally symbolic. Pigs were particularly important. They were sacrificed to Demeter during festivals, especially at the Thesmophoria. But why pigs? Several reasons. Pigs are remarkably fertile, producing large litters multiple times a year. They also root in the earth, disturbing the soil much like plowing does. And there's a myth, connected to Persephone's abduction, about pigs falling into the chasm that opened when Hades emerged. Those pigs, swallowed by the earth along with Persephone, became sacred to Demeter. Their sacrifice reenacted that loss and honored the goddess's grief. Serpents were also sacred to Demeter, not just any snakes, but specifically the kind that lived in cracks in rocks or in holes in the ground. These creatures were seen as mediators between the upper world and the underworld. They shed their skin and emerged renewed, symbolizing rebirth. Demeter was often shown with winged serpents pulling her chariot, magnificent creatures that could fly through the air or slither through the earth with equal ease. These serpents represented her mastery over both realms, her connection to life and death, growth and decay. Even geckos were sacred to her, those small lizards that live under rocks. They were seen as related to snakes, but more humble, more hidden. Finding a gecko under a stone was considered a good omen for farmers, a sign that Demeter was present in the land. The poppy was her sacred flower, and it carried multiple meanings. Poppies grow wild in wheat fields. They're bright red, standing out against the gold grain. They were beautiful, decorating the fields where Demeter's gifts grew. But poppies also produce opium, a powerful sedative. In ancient times, this connection to sleep and dream states made poppies symbols of the underworld as well. Sleep was seen as a little death, a temporary departure from the waking world. And Demeter, who understood both life and death, who'd experienced the death-like loss of her daughter, was appropriately associated with a flower that embodied this duality. Mint was another sacred plant, though its association with Demeter comes from a darker story. There was a nymph named Minthe who'd been Hades's lover before he abducted Persephone. When Demeter was searching for her daughter and learned about Hades's involvement, Minthe apparently mocked her, made some cruel comment about Demeter's grief or Persephone's fate, and Demeter, in her fury, transformed Minthe into the mint plant. It would forever grow low to the ground, trampled underfoot, its scent released only when crushed, a fitting punishment for someone who'd added insult to injury. Beyond physical symbols, Demeter had numerous epithets, titles that describe different aspects of her nature. She was Chloe, the green one, goddess of sprouting plants. She was Chrysaoros, lady of the golden blade. She was Chithonia, the underworld one. In regions where her connection to the realm of the dead was emphasized, she was called the lawgiver, the bringer of seasons, the grain mother, the fruit bearer. Each title highlighted a different aspect of her wide-ranging domain. Her chariot, pulled by those winged serpents, was itself a symbol of her divine power. Gods didn't walk everywhere like mortals. They had vehicles that reflected their nature. Zeus had his thunderbolts. Poseidon had his chariot, drawn by horses that could run across the waves. Helios had his sun chariot that lit the sky. And Demeter had winged dragons, creatures that connected earth and sky, that could travel anywhere she needed to go to bless the fields or search for her daughter. She was often depicted as a mature woman, not young and maiden-like, but not elderly either. matronly, dignified, sometimes wearing a crown or wreath, sometimes seated on a throne, always radiating a sense of patient power. She didn't need to be flashy. She didn't need elaborate costumes or dramatic poses. Her power spoke for itself. She was the one who made sure everyone ate. That was authority enough. In art, you could usually identify Demeter by the wheat she held, the torch in her hand, or the presence of Persephone nearby. Sometimes she was shown seated, receiving offerings. Sometimes she stood, bestowing blessings. But always there was a sense of groundedness to her depictions. She wasn't floating on clouds or wielding lightning. She stood on solid earth, because that's where her power was. In the soil, in the fields, in the very ground beneath everyone's feet. Understanding these symbols helps us understand how the Greeks viewed Demeter. She wasn't one-dimensional. She was complex, containing multitudes, life and death, joy and grief, abundance and famine, the bright red poppy and the golden grain growing side by side. And the ancient Greeks, who depended on her for their survival, knew to honor all aspects of her nature, the generous and the wrathful, the patient and the fierce. Because Demeter, like the earth itself, could nurture you or destroy you depending on how you treated her. We've covered many of Demeter's myths, but there's one we haven't fully explored yet. A darker story, less widely known than the tale of Persephone, but significant nonetheless. It's about Demeter and Poseidon, her brother, the god of the sea and earthquakes. And it's about a violation that led to one of the most enduring grudges in all of Greek mythology. The setting is Arcadia, a mountainous region in the Peloponnese, wild, rugged, the kind of place where civilization felt thin and the old primal forces of nature felt very close to the surface. Demeter was there during her search for Persephone, wandering the earth, asking everyone she met if they'd seen her daughter. And Poseidon, for reasons the myths never fully explain, became obsessed with her. Maybe it was her vulnerability. Maybe it was simply desire. Maybe he'd always wanted her and saw this moment of distraction as an opportunity. Whatever his motivation, Poseidon pursued Demeter, and she, grieving and desperate to continue her search, wanted nothing to do with him. She rejected his advances, clearly, repeatedly, but Poseidon didn't accept her rejection. He continued to pursue her, and Demeter, realizing he wasn't going to stop, took drastic action. She transformed herself into a mare and hid among a herd of horses owned by a local king. If she looked like any other horse, Poseidon wouldn't be able to find her. She could blend in, be invisible, continue searching for Persephone without this distraction, except Poseidon saw through the disguise, or maybe he didn't care, because he transformed himself into a stallion and mated with her by force. Even in the form of a horse, even in disguise, Demeter couldn't escape him. The assault happened, and from that union came two offspring. One was Arion, a magnificent horse. Not just any horse, this was a divine creature, immortal, impossibly fast, capable of human speech. Arion would go on to serve various heroes, saving lives with his speed, becoming a legend in his own right. But his origin was born of violence. He was the product of an assault that Demeter had desperately tried to avoid. The other child was Despoina, whose name means simply the mistress. And here's where it gets interesting. Despoina's real name was kept secret. Only those initiated into her mysteries, only those who worshipped her in Arcadia, knew what she was actually called. To everyone else, she was just the mistress, a goddess whose true identity was hidden, whose nature was shrouded in mystery. Some scholars think this secrecy reflected the trauma of her conception. She was the daughter of violence, and her name was too sacred, or perhaps too painful, to speak aloud. Demeter, after the assault, was shattered. Some versions say she was furious. Others say she was devastated. The truth was probably both. She was called Demeter Erinis, Demeter the Fury, in this form. She withdrew from her duties. She dressed in black. She hid herself in a cave in the mountains, refusing to come out, refusing to bless the earth. And once again, though for different reasons than the loss of Persephone, the world began to starve. The famine that resulted from this withdrawal was as severe as the one caused by Persephone's abduction. Maybe worse, because this time Demeter wasn't just grieving. She was traumatized. She'd been violated by her own brother, one of the most powerful gods in existence, and she needed time to process that, to purify herself, to reclaim some sense of autonomy and power. Eventually, she emerged from her cave. She bathed in the river Ladon, washing away the anger and violation. She became Demeter Lucia, Demeter the bathed. She'd undergone a ritual of purification and could function again. The earth began to grow. Life returned. But something had changed. A line had been drawn. Poseidon was never welcome in Demeter's spaces after that. His name didn't appear in her temples. His symbols never intertwined with hers. In a pantheon where gods regularly married each other, where family relationships were impossibly tangled, where Zeus himself had affairs with seemingly everyone, Demeter and Poseidon maintained absolute distance. The silence between them was total. And here's the thing about that silence. It was more devastating than any curse, more powerful than any act of vengeance, because Poseidon, despite his power, despite his importance, was effectively erased from Demeter's world. His storms avoided her groves. His waves didn't reach her blessed fields. It was as if she'd drawn a circle around everything sacred to her and said, "You are not allowed here." And Poseidon, perhaps recognizing that he'd crossed an unforgivable line, stayed away. This wasn't a feud in the traditional sense. Demeter didn't seek revenge. She didn't plot against Poseidon or try to harm him. She simply refused to acknowledge his existence. And in a world where recognition and worship mattered, where being ignored was a fate worse than being hated, this was perhaps the most devastating punishment she could inflict. The myth is uncomfortable. Greek mythology is full of these stories, gods assaulting goddesses, women violated by powerful men, and the myths often gloss over the trauma or frame it as romance. But Demeter's story doesn't do that. It acknowledges the violation. It shows the consequences. It demonstrates that even a goddess, even one as powerful as Demeter, can be harmed by someone stronger. And it shows that survival doesn't mean forgetting. It means setting boundaries and enforcing them absolutely. The worship of Despoina in Arcadia reflected this complexity. She was honored alongside her mother. The two were called the Despoinai, the mistresses, worshipped together in rites that involved animal masks and secret ceremonies. Despoina's sanctuary at Lycosura contained statues of both goddesses, along with images that suggested connections to animals and the wild. The rituals were mysterious, closed to outsiders, focused on themes of earth and fertility and the dark aspects of female power. Arion, the divine horse, carried his own complicated legacy. He was beautiful, powerful, impossible to ignore. Heroes competed for the right to ride him. He saved lives. He won races. But his origin, like Despoina's, was rooted in trauma. He represented the aftermath of violence, the way beauty and strength can emerge even from the worst circumstances. The Poseidon and Demeter myth doesn't get told as often as the story of Persephone. It's darker, more troubling. But it's part of Demeter's story, and pretending it doesn't exist does a disservice to understanding her fully. She wasn't just the patient goddess of agriculture. She was a survivor of assault who refused to let that violation define her. She set boundaries. She maintained her dignity. She ensured that Poseidon's presence would never again taint her sacred spaces. And perhaps that's one of Demeter's most important lessons. Power doesn't always mean striking back. Sometimes it means withdrawing completely. Sometimes it means creating a space where your violator simply isn't allowed. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who's harmed you is to make them irrelevant. As we approach the end of our journey through Demeter's mythology, it's worth stepping back and considering her broader impact. Not just on ancient Greek religion, but on how humanity has understood the relationship between humans and the earth for thousands of years. Because Demeter wasn't just a goddess, she was a symbol, an archetype, a way of understanding forces that were larger than any individual but absolutely essential for survival. To the ancient Greeks, Demeter represented security. When she was pleased, when she blessed the fields, life was good. There was food in abundance. Communities could thrive. Children grew up healthy. Art and philosophy flourished because people had the time and resources for things beyond mere survival. All of that came from Demeter's goodwill. All of it depended on keeping her happy. But Demeter also represented vulnerability, because as powerful as she was, she could be hurt. Her daughter could be stolen, she could be assaulted, she could suffer losses that would break anyone, mortal or divine. And when she hurt, everyone hurt. The entire world felt the weight of her grief. This made Demeter relatable in a way that many gods weren't. Zeus hurling thunderbolts was impressive, but distant. Demeter mourning her daughter. That was something every parent could understand. The cults that worshipped Demeter, particularly the Eleusinian Mysteries, offered something unique in ancient Greek religion. Most Greek religious practice was transactional. You made offerings to the gods and hoped they'd bless you in return. You attended festivals, you performed sacrifices, but you didn't necessarily get anything spiritual or personal from it. The mysteries were different. They promised transformation. They offered hope about death and the afterlife. They gave people a sense that there was meaning to the cycle of life and loss. This was revolutionary. The idea that a religious experience could change you, that initiation into a goddess's secrets could alter your understanding of existence itself, this was powerful, and it spread beyond Greece. When the Romans encountered Demeter, they recognized her immediately as equivalent to their own agricultural goddess, Ceres. The worship merged, the mysteries continued, and for centuries, people from across the ancient Mediterranean world made the pilgrimage to Eleusis, seeking what Demeter offered. But Demeter's influence extended beyond religion. She shaped how societies thought about agriculture. The festivals in her honor, the Thesmophoria and the others, weren't just religious observances. They were also agricultural calendars. They told people when to plant and when to harvest. They reinforced community bonds, because farming was communal work. They honored women, who were closely associated with fertility and with Demeter's worship. The goddess provided a framework for understanding the rhythm of the year and humanity's place within that rhythm. In art and literature, Demeter appeared frequently. She was depicted on pottery and in sculpture. Poets wrote about her grief and her power. Playwrights referenced her in their works. She was woven into the cultural fabric of Greece in a way that few other deities were, despite not being the flashiest or most dramatic god in the pantheon, because people understood, on a visceral level, that Demeter mattered. She was essential in a way that even Zeus, for all his authority, wasn't. And her mythology evolved over time. Early depictions of Demeter emphasized her role as an earth goddess, connected to the primitive, wild aspects of nature. But as Greek civilization developed, as agriculture became more sophisticated, Demeter evolved too. She became a goddess of civilized agriculture, of organized farming, of the laws and structures that made settled life possible. She represented not just growth, but cultivation, not just fertility, but husbandry. She was the goddess who taught humans to improve on nature, to work with the earth rather than just taking from it. The mother-daughter relationship between Demeter and Persephone has resonated through the ages. It's been reinterpreted in countless ways. As a metaphor for the changing seasons, yes, but also as a story about mothers and daughters learning to let go. About the transition from childhood to adulthood, about loss and reunion, about how separation can change both people in a relationship. Modern readers find new meanings in this ancient myth, seeing reflections of their own experiences in Demeter's grief and Persephone's transformation. Environmentally, Demeter has taken on new relevance in recent decades. As climate change and agricultural practices come under scrutiny, the goddess who represented sustainable relationship with the land feels more pertinent than ever. The myth of Erysichthon, with its themes of endless consumption and environmental destruction, reads like a parable for modern times. The idea that you can't just take from the earth without consequence, that disrespecting natural systems will lead to disaster. This is Demeter's ancient wisdom, speaking to contemporary concerns. There's also something profound about a powerful goddess whose strength comes from nurturing. In a pantheon full of war gods and tricksters, of deities defined by their ability to dominate or destroy, Demeter's power came from her ability to provide, to sustain, to make things grow. And the flip side of that power, her ability to withhold those gifts, was just as devastating as any thunderbolt or earthquake. It's a different kind of strength. a quieter kind of power, but no less real. The Greeks understood something important when they honored Demeter so fervently. They understood that civilization is fragile, that it depends on things beyond human control, the rain coming at the right time, the sun shining when needed, the soil remaining fertile, pests staying away from the crops. All of these things could be influenced by human action, yes, but ultimately they were in the hands of forces larger than any individual, and those forces needed to be respected. Demeter was the personification of those forces. She was the answer to the question of why crops grow. She was the explanation for why seasons change. She was the reason to celebrate harvest and to mourn winter. She gave meaning to the agricultural cycle that defined human existence for thousands of years. And in honoring her, the Greeks were acknowledging their dependence on the natural world, their humility in the face of forces beyond their control. This might be Demeter's most enduring gift. Not the wheat or the mysteries or even the lessons about motherhood and loss, but the reminder that humans are part of nature, not separate from it, that we depend on the earth, that disrespecting natural systems has consequences, that taking without giving back leads to famine and collapse, that the goddess who feeds you can also let you starve if you forget to honor her. These lessons feel ancient and modern at the same time, because fundamentally they're about relationship, about reciprocity, about understanding that the earth gives us what we need to survive, but that gift isn't unconditional. It requires care, respect, gratitude. And when we forget that, when we act like Erisichthon cutting down sacred groves for personal gain, we shouldn't be surprised when the abundance disappears. We've traveled through fields of golden grain and descended into the darkness of the underworld. We've witnessed a mother's grief that nearly ended civilization and seen how human ingenuity, guided by divine wisdom, created agriculture itself. We've met heroes and villains, gods and mortals, and explored myths that have shaped how cultures understand loss, renewal, and the cycles of nature for thousands of years. Demeter stands as one of the most complex figures in Greek mythology, not because her stories are the most elaborate, though the Persephone myth certainly ranks among the most important. Not because she had the most dramatic powers, though her ability to end all plant growth was terrifying in its simplicity, but because she represented something fundamental, something every human being depends on, but often takes for granted. She was the reason people didn't starve, the reason seasons turned, the reason civilization was possible at all. Her mythology contains multitudes. The patient teacher showing Triptolemus how to farm, the grieving mother searching desperately for her lost daughter, the furious goddess punishing those who dared desecrate her sacred spaces, the survivor who refused to let trauma define her but also refused to forgive the unforgivable, the generous provider whose withholding could destroy the world. She was all of these things at once, complex, contradictory, utterly human despite being divine. The ancient Greeks didn't worship Demeter because they thought she was perfect. They worshipped her because they needed her, because they understood that without her blessing, all their arts and philosophy and military might meant nothing. You can't philosophize on an empty stomach. You can't build temples if your people are starving. You can't maintain an empire if your fields produce no grain. Everything, ultimately, comes back to the earth's fertility. And Demeter controlled that. But her myths also taught compassion. The Eleusinian Mysteries, born from Demeter's experience of loss and reunion, offered initiates hope about death. They promised that the cycle continues, that what descends can rise again, that winter is followed by spring, that grief doesn't last forever, though it changes you. These weren't small gifts. For people living in a world where death was common and often came early, where disease and war and famine were constant threats, the promise that death wasn't the end mattered enormously. And the mother-daughter relationship at the heart of Demeter's most famous myth resonates across cultures and time periods. Every parent who's had to let go of a child, even temporarily, understands Demeter's panic when Persephone disappeared. Every adult who's had to negotiate independence from their parents understands Persephone's complicated position, married to Hades, but still her mother's daughter. The myth speaks to universal human experiences, which is why it survived for millennia. Demeter reminds us that sometimes the most important people aren't the loudest or the flashiest. They're the ones who keep everything running, who ensure everyone gets fed, who do the essential work that allows everyone else to thrive. And she reminds us that those people, whether goddesses or mortals, deserve honor and respect. Because when they stop doing their work, when they withdraw their labor, everything collapses remarkably quickly. She also reminds us about boundaries, about the importance of saying no, about how refusing to engage can be more powerful than any act of vengeance, about how survival sometimes means creating spaces where your abusers simply aren't allowed. These are uncomfortable lessons, but they're important ones. And finally, Demeter teaches us about reciprocity, about the relationship between humans and the natural world, about how taking without giving back leads to disaster, about how the Earth's bounty isn't infinite and needs to be respected. These lessons, taught 3,000 years ago in myths about an agricultural goddess, feel more relevant than ever in our current moment of environmental crisis. So next time you eat bread or admire a field of wheat swaying in the wind, or feel that first hint of spring after a long winter, think of Demeter, the goddess who made it all possible, the mother who would burn the world for her daughter, the survivor who refused to be defined by her trauma, the provider whose gifts we depend on every single day. She's not the most famous god in the Greek pantheon. She doesn't have as many blockbuster myths as Zeus or as many epic adventures as Heracles, but she might be the most important, because she represents something we can't live without: the Earth's fertility, the harvest's promise, the cycle of seasons that gives structure to our lives, and the hope that even in our darkest moments, spring will come again. If you've enjoyed this exploration of Demeter's mythology, consider subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more gods and heroes and mythical creatures to explore. Hit that like button if you appreciated the deep dive into agricultural divinity, and let me know in the comments which goddess or god you'd like to hear about next. Should we explore more of the Olympians? Dive into the Titans? Look at lesser-known deities who deserve more attention? Thank you for spending this time learning about Demeter with me. May your fields be fertile, your harvests abundant, and your winters followed by glorious springs. Until next time, when we'll explore another corner of the mythological world together. Sleep well, dream of golden wheat fields and mysterious torchlit rituals, and remember, the stories we tell about the gods are really stories about ourselves, about our fears and hopes, our relationships and losses, our place in the natural world. And Demeter's stories, more than most, remind us that we're all part of something larger, something cyclical, something that continues season after season, generation after generation, as reliable and necessary as the harvest itself.